In this video, we're going to look at the address book example. So this is VBA Day 4 examples off of Blackboard, and this is one that we did in class. So what we want to do is we want to get each of these listings. So there's a name, a street, and a combination of like a city, state, and a zip code. And instead of having them in a block of data, we want to get them into records. So for example, we want the output to look like this. So Melvin Kane 14812, Vienna, DC. Okay, so in order to do that, we're going to do something called batch processing. We're going to process each block individually, but we're going to process them in the same method each time. So because we're doing this, we can use a loop to do this. So first, let's just focus on, let me copy this so it's not at the top. Let's just focus on the first block and getting that set up before we decide to make this into a loop. So this is not something that you have to do, but I think it makes it easier when you're first starting to program, is that we're going to make a variable for each item of interest. So we're going to declare a variable for the name, for the street, and then we'll just call the last one city. So let's go ahead and do that. So dim name. Now they're all strings. They're all alphanumeric. So we'll have dim name as string, dim street as string, and then finally dim city as string. Okay, so we're just setting up kind of our variables that will hold the name, the street, and the city information, so we can kind of see it visually. All right, the next thing that we want to do is, in these types of problems, we've needed to declare a variable for representing where the output row and the output column is going to be. So in this case, we want the first piece of output to go here in cell C2. So we can make the output row 2 and the output column 3 to start, because that's where we want the output to start. So first, let's declare those two variables. And so these are going to be integers. So dim output row as integer and dim output column as integer. And then we just said we're going to set them to where we want the output to go, which is row 2 and column 3. So we'll assign the values of 2 and 3. So output row equals 2, output column equals 3. All right, we're almost done with our setup. So the next thing we want to do is set the cursor where the input, where the starting input is. So we want the cursor to start over Melvin Kane's name. That's the start of the input data. So in order to get it there, we're going to use select and use range of, that's cell A1 dot select. So at this point, if we save and run that, all we get is some variables set up, and the cursor ends up on cell A1. So if it's somewhere else, that's where it'll go. So at this point, let's not think about the loop. Let's just process the first bit of data. So what we want to do is first get the data from the sheet into our variables that we declared. So we want to set the name equal to Melvin Kane, the street equal to 148 12th Boulevard, and the city set to Vienna, DC. So we'll do that like this. So name equals, and we're going to use the active cell though. So we want to set it up so that we can put a loop in later. So it's based off of the position of the active cell. So the name is in the current active cell. So we're going to call active cell dot value. The street we can get using offset. So notice the street is offset by 1 row, And then the city is offset by 2 rows. So in order to do this, we'll do street equals active cell dot offset of 1 row down, 0 columns, dot value. Finally, we'll do city equals active cell dot offset to 0 dot value. Okay, so this grabs all of the data from the sheet in the first block and puts it into the variables that we have. So we've just put it in to the variables. Now we want to push it back out to the sheet into the output row and output column. So we're going to use our output row and output column variables to do this because they don't really line up with the active cell. So we have the following. We're going to put the name in cells, output row, comma, output column. So we'll set that value equal to the name. Then, so that's going to go here because the current row and column is 2 and 3. We want the street to go in the same row, but we want it to go in 1 column over. So we need to add 1 to make that an output column of 4. So we'll put the street in cells, output row, output column plus 1, dot value. It's going to be equal to street. And then finally, the city is offset by 2 columns. So we'll do cells, output row, output column plus 2, dot value equals the city. So at this point, when we run it, you see that we processed the first block. So that's good. But now what we want to do is we want it to automatically move the cursor from the first block to the second block and then process it the same exact way. So in order to get the cursor to move down there, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of hard code it. So we're not going to use, we're going to talk about XL down in our next class, but for right now, we're going to use offset to do this. So this assumes that there's only 1 row, blank row, between each block of data. Okay, so if we look at the offset, it's going to be offset by 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 rows down. So what we want to do is move the cursor. So choose a new active cell. So active cell dot offset, and we want it 4 rows down, 0 columns over, and we're going to select that. Okay, so at this point, let me move the cursor so you can see what happens when I run it. Actually, let me take this out too. So we get all the data from the first block, and then the cursor moves down to process the second block. So we have it set up now that it should work on the next block. The only thing left to change is the position of the output. So right now the output row is at 2, but when we process the next block, we want the output row to move down 1. So before our selection of the next active cell, I'm going to put in a line that basically adds 1 to the output row. So output row will equal output row plus 1. Okay, so this will make it so that it will move the output down 1. So at this point, we're now ready to put this into a loop so that it will process all of the data. So, and this is very important, below the selection of cell A1, otherwise we'll end up with an infinite loop, we're going to put our do until loop. So we're going to use do until is empty active cell dot value. So this will run until it reaches an empty cell. Now you may be thinking, well, there's an empty cell here. Does that mean it's going to stop when it gets there? It won't, because it will never actually inspect this cell. This line here that moves the offset that moves the active cell to an offset of 4 rows down, will automatically, it will move the cursor from here, to here, to here, and then to here. And it's at this point that it will recognize that there is a blank cell. So it will never actually hover over this cell, so it won't stop there. Okay, so for readability's sake, let's tab these lines inside the loop. And then make sure that you end the loop by writing the word loop at the end. And then finally, there's one other little cosmetic thing that we can do. Let's say we have a whole bunch of data that we want to process, and we want it to move the cursor back up to the top when we're done. So right now, if I run it, you'll see that it works, but the cursor ends up at the bottom. Let's do one last thing and move the active cell back up to the top. So we're going to just select cell A1, so range A1 dot select. Okay, so that processes every single little block, and it does so by repeating the same action until we reach a cell that doesn't have any value in it. So that's a nice introduction to batch processing.